in this lesson we'll start to add some additional exhaust behind our aircraft. Okay, so in our previous lesson we went through this process of adding some nice kind of billowy smoke and some other gaseous type effects that are coming from this fuel line. Now what I'd like to do is to turn this ship mesh back on and start to add a little bit more exhaust kind of to the back of this ship as it's flying away. Now, if you want, you can go ahead and skip through this lesson if you are already familiar with this process and sort of all the steps that we used to set up our particles, to shade them. I'm really going to use the exact same methods that we've already looked at. So, like I said, if you're already fairly familiar with this process, you can feel free to go ahead and skip through this and jump straight into the rendering section. So what I'm going to do is start by making a couple of simple objects here, because what we have here is a situation where we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different engines, and I really don't want to have to create and manage 5 different emitters to control all of these. So what I'd like to do is use basically one simple object and then use that as my source of emission. So what I can do is start by going in and creating something like a polygon plane. So that should work. Let's go ahead and hit the F key on our keyboard to frame in on that. And with this polyplane, I'll go ahead and set my divisions U and V to something like 2. Okay, so that we wind up with a 2 by 2 plane. Now let's grab this and sort of move it to where we want. In my case, I'm going to start at about frame 110, but you can start pretty much anywhere that you want. Now let's take this plane, let's rotate that around and make sure that it will actually fit here. So in my case, looks like that's going to need to be rotated around about -90. There we go, and we'll scale this up just a little bit, so that way it's a little bit easier to grab. And let's make sure that we get it in this other view as well. If we can find it, there it is. And we'll line this up pretty close with this engine. Okay, and again, I'm going to press the F key on my keyboard to frame in on that. So now, what I'm going to do is take this plane, Control D to duplicate, and really just sort of position a duplicate plane over each one of these engines. I'm just going to work in a couple of different views to make this a little bit easier for me. There we go, so now we have another duplicate plane over here. Control D to duplicate. We'll put another plane over this back engine. There we are. Select this guy once again, Control D to duplicate. Put that over this back engine. It doesn't have to be a perfect fit, we're just sort of roughly positioning these in place. And once again, Control D to duplicate and position that over the final engine. So now we have these 5 different objects, and what I can do to make one emitter that is going to emit out of all of these, I first need to take these objects and collapse them down into one piece of geometry. So go back to Polygons, go to Mesh, and Combine. Okay, very good. So now we have these guys where if you select them, it's now one piece of geometry, which is exactly what I want. Let's go to Modify and Center Pivot. So that way we can move the center point back to the center of all of these guys. Now, let's make some particles start to come out the back. Now, at this point, if I use the Emit from Surface command, what's going to happen is we're going to get particles that emit from every single vertex on this surface. And in some cases you may want that, but in my case, I really just want this central or middle vertex to be my particle emitter. So I can go in, Shift Select that center vertex from all of these different pieces, go back to my Dynamics menu, and with these selected, let's go to Create and Emit from Object. Okay, so now if I rewind and hit play, if you look very closely, we can start to see some particles that are coming out of the center vertex of each one of these little planes here. So let's start by controlling the actual emission here. Let's see if we can't grab these particles themselves. It might be a little bit easier if I use my selection mask and turn off the geometry so that way I can grab these particles. There we go. And let's start to control the emitter. So just like we did previously, we'll set this from an omni to a directional. Let's play this back. You can see now it's moving and emitting these particles out just sort of in a side direction. Now I really sort of want these particles to emit backward, sort of along the back of the ship. So I'm going to need to emit these really along this z-axis. So I'll set the direction x to 0, set the direction z to 1, which should actually emit those along the positive z-axis, which is going to push those particles forward. Actually not the direction that I want, which you can see is exactly the case here. It's emitting those particles and pushing those forward. Now let's take that spread, or that direction, and set that to a -1. Okay, let's rewind, play that back. Okay, now you can start to see where it looks like we have some sort of improper particle behavior, where if you look closely you can see we have this little stream of particles here, but I also have sort of this odd little stream of particles that are coming off to the side, and they really shouldn't be there. If I rewind, you can see that those little points also stay behind. Now again, this is a situation where our timeline, it becomes very, very important for us to make sure that we always start from the beginning of our timeline. Starting at frame 110 was okay for this hose because we really didn't have any particles that started before frame 110. Now in this case, with these little planes here, we do have particles that start all the way at frame 1, which means by starting our timeline at frame 110, starts to get us into some incorrect behaviors here. So let's go ahead and extend the timeline, make sure that we start all the way back at frame 1, and now you can see this works just the way it should. Okay, now unfortunately at this point that does sort of mess us up as far as the alignment of these planes here, but we can always come in and fix that here in a little bit. So let's go ahead and grab these particles here. There we are, try to grab those. And let's start to make a few changes to this. So let's start by taking our speed, and we'll really bring this up, maybe something like 500, and a nice little randomization there. Maybe just a little bit of spread on these particles as well, so that way we start to get kind of a nice forceful blasting of particles. Now that's going to be a really, really strong spread, so let's try to bring that back in a little bit more. Okay. Now for the rate on this, I'm going to go ahead and maybe bring this down to something like 5, and then turn on this scale rate by speed. There we go, so that gives us a nice filling in of particles here. Again, the spread seems a little bit too high, so I'm going to continue to bring this down to a little bit lower value. There we go, so that way we just kind of get a nice little stream of particle exhaust here. Very good. Now let's go back to frame 110, which is where I had aligned these particles, or these planes, to the surface itself. Now let's go grab these little planes. Let's go to our outliner, and let's find where this ship animation is. So I'm just going to right click on this outliner, turn off this show DAG objects only if that does happen to be turned on. And for this aircraft, or this ship, let's go ahead and expand that. Alright, and we're going to look for this ship CC01, or CC ship 01. And what we should be able to do is take these poly surfaces here, just simply middle click, and drop those underneath that ship CC01. And so now when we play this back, we should see that these little planes now move with the ship. And that's exactly what we want. Alright, very nice. Now, let's start to come in and set up some animation for this. So just like we had done earlier, let's go to our rate, find the point at which the ship is going to start to take off. So that's again probably going to be right around frame 120 or so. There we are. So let's right click, set key. Let's go forward one frame. set that rate down to 0, and then set another key. So now we play this through. You can see the hose breaks away, the ship takes off, and there we go. Now let's also make sure that we have our particles set to eventually die at some point, because right now these particles are just going to live forever. So let's go to our particle shape, go to that lifespan, let's set this to a random range, and for our lifespan we can set this maybe to something like half a second, with just a little bit of variance in here. With these particles, because they're moving so fast and we have so many of them, again, we really don't want just a whole long stream of particles. And because our object is moving, it does help to sort of stretch those particles out. You can see when the ship is kind of static and still, we just wind up with that little bitty trail of particles. But once the ship actually starts to pull away and fly away, that actually results in a fairly long little stream of particles. Okay, very nice. So let's maybe jump over to our shot cam so we can see how this is all starting to come together. So we play this through. The ship breaks away and starts to fly away. Now at this point we can start to change some of the appearance of our particles as far as the rendered appearance goes. Again, by default these are going to be just points, which means that when we render this out, we're just going to wind up with these little dots here. So just like we did in our previous lesson, we're going to set this to a cloud type. Now let's click on this add attribute for current render type and start to give this maybe a little bit higher radius, maybe something like 3. Okay, so now we get some software rendered particles in here. And just like before, let's come in, add a general attribute for this. Go to particle, and we're going to add radius per particle. Press OK, so that way these particles can start off at a certain size and then grow as they start to get larger. So right click, create ramp, and now right click and edit ramp. So we're going to go ahead and remove that little spacer there. For the value, we'll go ahead and just leave that one maybe at 1. And for this upper value, once the particles start to reach the end of their life, we'll say that these get maybe somewhere up to maybe 30. So that way, again, they start off really, really small and then start to grow as they get a little bit older. Okay, let's maybe see if we can't catch that at a little bit better frame and see what our behavior looks like, or our overall rendered appearance looks like, I should say. Alright, so overall I sort of like how that looks. Now let's try to go in and change that particle color to something other than blue. Now, just like we did before, I'm not going to make it a point to adjust this default particle cloud, because again, any new particles that I make need to have that material. So rather than change that, I'll just make myself a completely fresh new material for this cloud. So let's add a new material. Let's go to particle cloud, which is going to be right down here. Again, I like to set my color to black. For the incandescence on this, I'll give it sort of a nice, kind of a dark gray color. For the life transparency, we'll give this a ramp, again, so that way these particles can sort of start off nice and opaque and then start to die off and get a little bit more transparent as they get older. So let's follow that connection. For this bottom color, let's set that to white, or rather let's actually set that to black, so that way black means no transparency. And up here at white, that means we'll have now full transparency as the particles start to reach the end of their life. And again, we could maybe use something like an exponential down to make that transition happen a little bit more rapidly. Okay, let's see what that does for us. Let's give this just a moment to play through. Try to find a decent stopping point for this frame, and render that out. Okay, nice. So we can see we're starting to get a little bit of this kind of a vapor back here. Now let's maybe take that density and bring that down quite a bit, because we really don't want this to be just a really, really thick plume of smoke. we want that to be a little bit more subtle. So sometimes you'll need to bring these down to a really, really low value to start to see that really, really nice, soft little subtle effect here. Okay, and we can continue to play with this, but for now, this looks like that's actually going to be pretty good. Now you can see that we have kind of these little planes that still show up in the render. We'll actually talk about how we can start to hide those and remove those from the visibility of the render once we start to get into our lighting and rendering section of this course here in the next couple of lessons. So for now, that will go ahead and bring us to the end of this dynamics. So now we have this hose that sort of breaks away. If we take a quick render of that, you can see that starts to now spill out the fuel from this ship. And then the ship's thrusters start to kick in and basically accelerate it away from this fueling station. Okay, very nice. So now that we have this all set up, we're ready to pretty much finish out this whole scene with a little bit of lighting and some rendering. So we'll start to accomplish that in this next section.